Born in a farmhouse in Canoe Cove, PEI, on the 28th of October 1928. The oldest of 7 children. My grandmother was midwife, who attended with my mother when I was born. Well, we grew up in an old farmhouse which my grandfather had built maybe 100 years before, and that was before the days of any insulation. So the only source of heat, of course, was wood, and they had an old wood furnace and the wood stove in the kitchen, but it took a lot of wood, and of course during the night the fires would go out, so when you woke in the morning kettle could be have some ice in it in the kitchen stove, and it needed a lot of blankets on the bed to keep warm, and then you had to crawl out, get dressed, get down, get the old kitchen fire going to get warmed up. I don't know when, I suppose when I was 5 or 6 years old, we had to start milking the cows. So there was always chores to do, get up in the morning, and there was cows to milk, and horses and cows and pigs and sheep and everything to feed, hens to feed, gather the eggs. And so it was just a way of life that as soon as you're old enough, somebody was responsible for bringing the firewood in, somebody for bringing water in from the outside well. There was no inside bathrooms. I had the old outhouse. The Eaton's catalogue was the favorite toilet paper, or newspapers or something, but toilet paper and all those things were never heard of at that stage. Well, Canoe Cove, I guess, was a strictly rural farming fishing area. There was one grocery store, my father's blacksmith shop, a one-room school, community hall, one Presbyterian church that we attended, and of course we knew all the neighbors around, and there was no electricity, and there was a party line for a telephone system, so that when the phone rang, everybody in the neighborhood picked up their phones to listen to see what was going on. In fact, I still have the old phone at the house. That was installed back in the old farmhouse in 1918, but there was no phone service or private phone service until sometime in the 50s. And I think the old house at home was wired for electricity in 1950. So I guess another thing was that we didn't have a car. When I was a kid growing up, I think the first car we had was about 1938 or 1939, and it was an old 1928 Whippet. So most of the transportation was horse and buggy in the summertime and horse and sleigh in the winter. I started school when I was 5 years old in the one-room school. Spent 8 years there, and finished school with a grade 9 education when I was 13 years old. It was a one-room school, but there was maybe 30 to 35 pupils, and that depending usually on the time of year. During the spring and summer months, when the older boys were farming. They wouldn't be in school, but in the wintertime they'd come to school for a few months. But they had one teacher who taught 10 grades. So I guess that was why I, kind of got out after, well, I did 9 grades in 8 years. But, if you're paying any attention, you listen to the work that the older kids were doing from the time you started school. So but I think it seems to me we used to, the class would stand up and they'd have a spelling match or something like that, or they'd have a history lesson, a lot of oral work. So you're involved with kids at all ages. Just one teacher to teach, but of course that was all we knew about school. Just whatever you picked up there. And I guess that was one of Mother's, sort of hopes that I would be able to get through school and go to, they used to call it Prince of Wales College in Charlottetown, and that was a big deal if anybody could make it to Prince of Wales. But that cost money, and so there just wasn't the dollars around. And very few kids ever got through to go to college or university from that rural start in the one-room school. My father's name was Malcolm, but he was always known as Mac. He was the second of a family of 10, and he grew up working with his father, who was a carriage builder, and his uncle, who was a blacksmith. And his father died at age 52 from the flu and pneumonia back in 1920. So Dad, at that time, was 21, 22 years old, and he became one of the breadwinners for the rest of the family, including Uncle Everett, who was 6 months old at the time. So Dad continued to work in the blacksmith shop with his uncle, and his older brother, Bateman, ran the carriage shop for a number of years. And eventually the family split up, and grandmother remarried. A couple of the family went with her. Uncle Colin moved in with Dad and Mother when they were married, and they lived with my mother's father, my grandfather McKinnon, on the farm, and Dad built a new blacksmith shop on the farm. So that was his main occupation, was blacksmithing. He also fished lobsters during the months of May and June for 40-odd years, I guess, which was usually his main cash business for the year, that he would make some dollars in lobsters. And although he lived on the farm, he never liked farming, never did much farming. If he could escape it, he would find something to do in the blacksmith shop or somewhere else. I used to go out fishing with him on Saturdays, maybe. I always wanted to get out, but it was, well, you got work to do home on the farm. I was old enough to get out. But I do remember one day going out with them. I suppose I was, maybe 10 years old, and the wind come up, and so they were worried that if I stayed back in the stern of the boat where they were working fishing, that I might fall overboard. So they said, you got to go up in the bow of the boat. So of course up in the bow of the boat it was just smell of fumes, and it wasn't long till I got sick. but I had to stay there until they decided it was time to come ashore. By the time they came ashore, the boat was on a mooring. They didn't have a wharf. The boat was on a mooring, so then we had to sit on the boat in this wind until the wind went down pretty well late in the day. So that was a long day. I didn't want to go out in the boat for a while after that. But in fact, even I remember after I come home, sitting on a chair, and I was still rocking on the chair. I didn't say. I guess he seemed to be, he was always a good craftsman. Was well known, well liked for the work he did, and was always rated as a good blacksmith. But he was, he always had to do all his work by hand because there was no electricity. So he would take a piece of plank and shape shafts for a sleigh or a wagon or runners or parts, and did all that work by hand. Now, my mother's name was Mary Bell. She was always known as Mary Bell. And as I said earlier, she was the oldest of two. But yeah, she had a hard life, really, because there was no conveniences or anything to work with. She had to cook on an old wood stove, and wash everything had to be washed by hand. And there was a lot of heavy clothing and everything, but she had to do it practically all on the old washboard. I don't remember that there was even the old hand washing machines, which were operated just with a lever. There was no power to operate them, but I know that most of her work, including in spring of the year, she'd be washing heavy wool blankets and bed coverings and clothing and wool socks and everything like that, and all by hand, heating water on the stove, and then cooking for a crowd of people all the time. But I don't know. They were involved in much involved in the church. Mother was taught Sunday school, and she was involved with the Women's Missionary Society, and they had the old Orange Lodge. They were both members of the Orange Lodge, and I guess I don't know, they were involved much. I think Dad maybe was a school trustee, but and they just had a lot of friends and did a lot of visiting, and both summer and winter. In the wintertime, we'd maybe in the evening take off with the horse and sleigh and go a mile or so to visit some of the neighbors. Always seemed to be lots to eat. Everybody had to have a cup of tea. And never went anywhere but they wanted to have something to eat. Brother Glenn was born in 1930, Victor in 1932, Sister Kay in 1936, Sadie in 1937, Everett and Curtis, the twins, late arrivals, born in 1943. Glenn was the brother next to me. He was a couple of years younger than me, but bigger and a better fighter. So we had a lot of bloody noses when we used to tangle. And that was the entertainment sometimes when people come near it. We'd get into a fight and they'd just let us go at it to see who won. But Glenn had kind of a short temper. But so he ended up staying home on the farm, doing the farming, and he drove a school bus for maybe 30 years. And when after the days of the one-room schools, when they consolidated the schools on the island, they put school buses on. So Glenn became one of the bus drivers, and so he was known to everybody for miles around. He's a local bus driver. Victor was, again, a couple of years younger than Glenn. Victor came to Moncton after I did for maybe a few months and started as an apprentice in the shops, but hated it, so he left and joined the Navy. So he spent 5 years in the Navy, and then the rest of his career, and he switched after 5 years in the Navy, switched to the Air Force, and spent the rest of his career in the Air Force. Remember Victor, one thing I remember Victor is the first day he went to school, they sat him with a girl. They had double desks, so they sat him with a girl, and he was horrified. But anyway, he was always interested in sort of craft work, and I remember one time he built a model fishing boat out of leftover laths that he found around the shop when Dad was building his lobster traps. He made a model boat which was maybe 3 feet long or so, but he always loved to be around the water and boats, stories, and so on. And Kay, of course, was the oldest sister. She married, had 9 children, and taught school, got her Bachelor of Education just about the time her youngest daughter Jennifer was born, and she's a retired teacher. I guess what I remember most about Kay, and Kay, there's Sadie, and Sadie was born in 1937. But then the Everett and Curtis, the twins, were born in 1943, so Kay and Sadie sort of became little mothers to them. I think Everett was Kay's sort of doll, and Curtis was Sadie's. So, they were mother's helpers, and they weren't that old when I left home either. Kay would have been maybe 10, 11. Sadie's a year younger. Twins were 4 years old. But the twins were always great entertainment when they were little guys. They had boxing gloves for them, and they used to get the boxing gloves on and fight her out. One incident that comes to mind with the twins was one day it was in the fall of the year, and I was working in the blacksmith shop with Dad, and all of a sudden we hear screaming, and they're coming down the lane towards the old blacksmith shop, just a booting her. So I ran to meet them and said, "What happened?" "Oh, it was fire." So found out that they were in the house alone for some reason, and they tried to light the fire in the kitchen stove, and did what they used to see the rest of us doing, was put a little bit of kerosene or something on it to start the fire. But I think they got a can with gasoline in it and dumped some gasoline into the stove, and when they lit the match to it, it blew the covers off the stove. And I think kind of singed their brows, so they didn't stay around very long to see what was going on. They took off and headed for the porch. I guess that taught them a lesson about playing with fire. I guess being the oldest, I was always pretty demanding. Seems to be I always fought pretty hard to get things I wanted, or get to go places I wanted. But then I guess I also the one was usually called on to do a lot of the chores or do a lot of the things around the farm. But as I get older, in the winter time particularly, when we used to take a horse and sleigh to go to school, so I'd have to take the kids to school, and then I used to go to my Uncle Collins, who lived handy at school, and put the horse in the stable there for the day, and back to school. Of course, looked after getting the kids home again, and that sometimes was a little trying if you get in a snowstorm and there's snow. And it's usually, wouldn't it be what we used to call a wood sleigh, which is a big box sleigh, and so it wouldn't be just our kids, it'd be half the kids along the road for hanging on the sleigh. Well, I guess some of our entertainment used to be just to hang around the country store in evenings, and or we'd maybe have a ball game going in the summertime, or there was an outdoor hockey rink. Or I was never much at hockey, but we used to play a bit of hockey, or just come or go to the hockey games. But no, there wasn't much time. I mean, get your school time in and got all the chores done. You didn't have much free time to get in too much trouble. Did get in trouble one time. It was in in April, spring breakup, and so Dad was getting ready for fishing lobsters, and he was in Charlottetown, so he bought a new lunch can. So he come home with his lunch can, so I begged him to let me use it, take it to school. It was going to be the big shot, having this new lunch can to take to school. So I took it to school, and on the way home, stopped at a buddy of mine, and we decided we were going to build a raft so we could float it down the brook. So there was a little woodlot behind their house, so we get out in the woodlot and got an old axe out and chopped down an old deadfall tree, but we felled it right on the lunch can. So I had to go home with this flattened lunch can. So I was kind of in trouble over that. One of the pastimes, then of course there was no radio or television. One of our pastimes was netting trap heads for lobster traps for Dad for fishing. And so sit around in the evening, and I think we used to get maybe 2 cents a head for netting them or something, but that was one of our winter entertainment. Or we would play games like crokinole or something like that, but there was never any cards allowed in the house. Mother wouldn't have any kind of a gambling going on at home, so the cards were out. There might be the odd concert, or there was square dances. We used to go to square dance, or they used to have called box socials, where the girls would make up box lunches, and they used to have an auction, so the boys would all bid. So if they knew one particular guy wanted to get that girl's box lunch, then they would bid against him and bid him up all they could just to torment them. So that was usually good for an evening's entertainment. Of course, living in the country on a dark night, it was absolutely black. There was no lights or anything. But one night I'd walked. We were about a mile from the school and hall and the store. So one night I'd gone to the movies, and I was walking home, and all of a sudden I got picked off my feet by my buddy on a bicycle. And I was riding right on the handlebars of the bicycle. I don't know if it was the same night, but it was a similar incident. And I was coming home walking across through the neighbor's yard, and I knew there was cows in the yard, so I was walking with kind of my hand out. But I didn't allow for the fact that the cow was laying down. So when I landed on the cow's back, I wasn't long being tossed off again. And another one that's along the same lines. In the wintertime, when the summer used to milk maybe 5 or 6 cows, but in the wintertime they used to try to keep one cow milking just so we had milk for the house. So one evening, I come in, I'd been out playing or something, and I come in and Mother said, "Did you milk the cow yet?" I said, "No." So by this time it was dark. Of course, I should have done it while it was still daylight. But anyway, so I just grabbed a bucket. So instead of taking a lantern, I thought, well, I know just where that cow is in the barn. I know where the stool is, so I think I can go out and I can go and milk the cow without any light. So the same thing happened. I walked in, held the stool up the field till it touched the cow, but the cow was laying down. So she upset me end over end, bucket and all. In the old Presbyterian church, and back in those days, the elders led the singing in the church, and they did what was called presenting, and that they would present lines of the old Scottish hymns, and then everybody would sing the line. And the elders also led in prayer, and they used to take turns on Sundays, and so each one of them, I think, maybe had their own sort of prayer memorized so you could knew almost what words to expect from the different ones as they led in prayer, but they were very, what you say, very pumped up about their prayers, and they'd go on, and the hands would be going, and so it used to be quite entertaining, really, to us as kids. And the other thing that used to happen in those old church services, that some of the women would get all worked up, and all of a sudden one of them would jump up and they'd say, "Hallelujah, hallelujah," and if some of the old guys had to be half asleep, they soon came awake when some woman started yelling. Which reminds me of another little story of the church. One Sunday evening we were in church, and as I said earlier, there was no electricity, so they had Coleman lamps. So instead of lighting the lamps before the service started, the janitor waited until the minister, he thought, was pretty well through preaching, and he decided that they needed some light to sing the last hymn. So he lifted his lamp and brought it in and hung it on a hook. But he didn't get it right on the hook, and just as he let go, the lamp dropped on the floor. So he grabbed the lamp and ran out the door with it and threw it out in the field. And got his hands burned, but of course everybody panicked and started to run out of the church because they thought there was going to be a fire. But the first thing that happened when people come back in, the minister said, "Well, now see how worried you are about the physical fire. You should be just as worried about the spiritual fire." But anyway, the next morning, one of the neighbors came into the blacksmith shop, and he and Dad were talking about this fire and so on. And the old guy says, he said, "I bent down to pick up my hat, and a woman went right over my head." Oh, he said, "Right over my head, just like a bird." And that was another problem they used to have, was that it took so much wood to heat the old house. And I think they used to cut something like 25 cords of wood in the wintertime and try to have enough cut, split, and dried so that there was enough for next winter. But quite often towards the end of the winter, you'd run out of dried wood, so then they'd end up trying to burn green wood. And so sometimes I'd even stick some of the green wood in the oven to try to dry it out, which was kind of a losing business because you're burning wood to dry wood to get some more. But there was always a house full, it seemed, because grandfather had an old maid sister who lived with us when they were married, and Dad's brother Colin lived with us. And there'd sometimes be a housekeeper, or there would be somebody working the farm hand that would stay. And then with Dad having the blacksmith shop, the neighbors would come sometimes for some miles around to get work done. And if they happened to be at the shop at mealtime, if Mother called Dad to come to dinner, he brought neighbors with him. So we used to say, when we were kids, you'd get up in the morning and smell nice roast of beef cooking, but by the time the adults and the neighbors got fed, we might end up having an egg sandwich because the rest was gone. And another memory is that they were always seemed to be hosting people. They'd go to church on Sunday morning, and invariably the minister and his wife would be invited to come for dinner, and some other neighbors who would come from some distance, and they'd all come, particularly in the months of May and June when Dad was fishing lobsters, because that was always a chance for people to come for Sunday dinner and get a feed of lobsters. And I can still remember Dad coming home with a 50-pound potato bag full of lobsters over his shoulder. And it was always, word was on Saturday, get the old wash boiler out and have the water hot when Dad got home, so there'd be hot water to cook the lobsters for the weekend. We ate a lot of lobster, and the old saying at that time was, the poor kids had lobster sandwiches to take to school, and the rich kids had peanut butter. Lobsters were plentiful, but peanut butter was expensive. I look back and I think how poor we were and how scarce money was, because an early memory was of spending a day with my dad driving around the neighborhood in a horse and buggy where he was giving out his annual bills, no monthly or weekly bills then, his annual bills for all the work he had done in the blacksmith shop, shoeing horses and repairing wagons and so on. And after a whole day of traveling around the neighborhood, he'd come home with one $2 bill. A lot of promises. Everybody said, well, if I could sell a few potatoes, or if I could sell a few turnips, or if I could sell a beef cow or sell some pigs. But sorry, Mac, we don't have any money. So that was really depression years, and nobody had any funds. But Dad's problem was that he owed money to the hardware store where he buy his supplies, which he had to pay for. So, but people would come to get work done, not having any money and no idea when they were going to pay, but they figured they should get their work done. I used to think when I was growing up, I think, boy, if we just had some more equipment and had more space here, and we could do a lot more things and build a bigger business. But he spent most of his life working by hand. So when I finished school at age 13, as I said, I did some work on the farm. Then I did some work with him in the blacksmith shop. I used to farm. We had 3 horses, and a lot of the work, the plowing and harrowing and disking, was all done with either 2 or 3 horses. 3 horses mostly for the plow or the harrow, but you walked behind the plow or walked behind the harrows. There were long days when you started, any time after 6 in the morning, get up and feed the horses and get your breakfast and milk the cows, and then get out and start following horses from then until supper time. I've always said I got my fill of farming and gardening, and I haven't done any since. One of the things from working in the shop one day was the old drill press was operated with a hand crank, and I was standing on a nail keg turning the crank, and I lost my balance, and I put that finger right in through the cogs in the drill. There's still grease in that finger from the time I was a kid so high. Well, I learned to shoe horses, and I've had a bad knee ever since from hitting my knee when the horse pulled his foot back when I went to hit the nail, and I hit the kneecap instead of the nail. So, but we shod horses. We repaired all kinds of farm machinery. I remember one job I had was doing all the iron work for a farm trailer that one of the neighbors brought in. He wanted a box put on the trailer, so I ended up doing all the iron work for the hinges and latches for the tailgate and braces that used to go on the sides, and irons to put the sideboards on and that sort of thing. I think I worked for, I don't know, maybe a couple of weeks on that, and when he came to get it, he said, "How much do you owe you?" And I said, "Well, I think it should be worth $25, and he almost had a fit. He thought I was charging him too much money for it. When we used to repair wagon wheels, and to put the tires back on the wheels after they were repaired, we used to set them out in the yard and build a fire right around the tire and heat the tire to expand it so that it would go on the rims. So you had to kind of pick a time, a nice evening when there wasn't any wind, and we used to use kindling and shingles and shavings and so on, put it all the way around the fire, all the way around the rims. And then again, pour some kerosene or something so that the fire would start quick all the way around. But this evening I couldn't find any kerosene, so I thought, well, I'll put some gas on it. And so I sprinkled the gas all the way around and tossed a match on it. And of course, you're doing, puff, and there were shingles and stuff flying in all directions. But an old neighbor was sitting in his buggy talking to Dad when this thing blew. And before he knew it, the old horse had bolted. He was about a quarter mile down the road before he even got the horse stopped. Shoeing some of the horses was kind of interesting at times, because they used to bring in a lot of horses from Alberta and Saskatchewan. Some of them had never, big perching horses, they'd never seen a shoe on them. You'd wrestle with those guys. Sometimes come out on the short end of that. I'll always remember my last day working with him was in the fall of 1947, and after the first snowstorm, when every neighbor for miles around brought their horses to be shod. And that one day we shod 28 horses. And I did most of the work, what we called on the floor, removing old shoes and trimming hoofs and putting new shoes on while Dad worked on the anvil, shaping and corking the shoes. And back in those days, they used to choose, I guess, or I should say, maybe 4 or 5 young fellows from the island to come to Moncton as apprentices in the shops. And so in 47, I was able to get here, and I guess one of the reasons I was interested in, one of the reasons I came was Uncle Everett was an apprentice in the shops at the time. So I left home on the 2nd of December in 1947. A borrowed suitcase and a $20 bill. Came to the big city of Moncton. Started as an apprentice and had a choice of painter, apprentice, boilermaker, or blacksmith. So the old instructor took me down through the shops, and he said, well, see what goes on in those shops. So I didn't like painting. I knew that to start with. So it was kind of a choice between being a boilermaker or a blacksmith. And as we walked through the boiler shop, somebody let go of the rivet gun on the boiler. And I thought, oh, I don't like that either. So knowing something about blacksmithing, I thought, well, that'll be the easiest place to start. So I started a new blacksmith shop. So I stayed with Uncle Everett and Daisy for first month, I guess, until I got a paycheck. And then I moved into a boarding house. So we were making, I think it was about $21 a week. And I paid $12 a week for board. So that, and then there was maybe $1 or $2 for deductions. So I had $5 or $6 a week left over to live on, do whatever with, buy clothes and so on. So anyway, I was an apprentice. I was in 47. I guess I finished my apprenticeship about 1952, 52 or 53. And I guess I was lucky in that respect. I got to spend a year in the drafting office as part of my apprentice time. So I worked then for a couple of years on the tools as a tradesman. And back in those days there were steam locomotives, so we did some real heavy forgings for side rods and axles and brake gear and everything for locomotives, cars. Built a lot of springs, suspension springs for locomotives and passenger cars. Did a lot of welding work, a lot of welding, oxyacetylene and electric welding. So then in 1954, the foreman that I worked for was transferred to Montreal, so I got a chance to be the foreman. And first day I started was the day that I brought you home from the hospital, 1954. Well, that was an interesting time because I was 25 years old and foreman over about 50 to 60 old hard-time union members that had been there for years, and they immediately dubbed me the kid. And so I had to kind of work hard at trying to build a relationship with them and show them that I knew a little bit about what I was doing. And to add to my problem, the general foreman over me was an old alcoholic. And he had a great habit of undoing what I had done. If I assigned somebody to a job for the day or want certain work done for a department, he would come along behind me and tell people to do something different. Of course, they listened to him rather than me. So I had a few months of that, ended up with an ulcer. So took a week or so off, sick leave. Old saying kicked in, I guess. It said, "Let one go. Oh, it's not what you're eating; it's what's eating you." And then learn to leave the job at 5 o'clock and don't bring your work home with you. So I learned pretty early that you can't live at 24 hours a day. But, I worked for a couple of years as foreman in the blacksmith shop, and then I was moved over to another department which was known as the frog shop, where we made all the rail crossing components. And railway crossings, where the two tracks meet or cross, and that's known as a frog, where the rails are put together and cross so trains can run cross one track onto another. And then the switch points, which is at the point at which the trains switch from one track to another. So that was a very interesting department to work in. And one particular job that I was given one day was that they wanted what they called a diamond crossing built. So this was where two tracks crossed, but all they gave me to work with was an angle. And they said, we want those two tracks to cross, we'll say at an angle of 40 degrees. No drawings, nothing to work with, just here's what we need. So I had to make up my own drawings, and then had to get all the machining and milling and forging done to make up all the components for this. So that was an interesting project that I worked on one winter when I was there. But we turned out all kinds of parts for rails crossings, so it's an interesting part. I guess the highlight of my time in the shops was in the winter of 1961 when the old Prince Edward Island ferry ran into the cement abutment at the dock in Borden. And when it did, it shortened the ferry by about 6 feet and completely demolished the bow, or the stem bow, which was a steel bow. So at that time there was then just the Prince Edward and the old Abigail operating, and there was heavy ice in the straits, so they couldn't get the ferry to a dry dock anywhere. So they was sort of a panic in case the old Abigail broke down, that there'd be no transportation to the island. So in desperation, I guess, they came into the shops to see if there was any way that we could do any repair work on the ferry. So they went to the superintendent's office, and he said, they're not in the shipbuilding business. I don't think there's anything we can do here, but if you want to go down to the blacksmith shop, talk to them down there. So when they come down, they had the drawings of the old stem. So I picked it up as a challenge and said, yeah, I think we can do something with that. So we ended up making a new stem for the ferry, and it was like a big hockey stick. It was about 40 feet long and curved at the base, but I think the steel in it was 3 inches thick and 10 inches wide, and it had to be bent in the shape of like a hockey stick, and then it took 3 sections welded together and then reinforced with reinforcing plates, and then we put plates on the foot of this thing to flare like the flare of the bow, so it flared the bow, and we did it in a little over a week. But it was a time when they just said, overtime, any overtime you need, money's not the object, we got to get this ship back in service. So when we had it finished, while it was there, they had an inspector from Lloyd's of London in the shop seeing this thing being done. And we had to make test pieces to test it, to see that it had the proper tensile strength, to see that the steel would bend at a certain angle without breaking. And so we passed all those tests and made it up. So when the thing was completed, the engineer who was in charge asked me or I guess asked the superintendent if they would allow me to go down to Borden for a few days to see that the thing fitted and that there was any adjustments needed, which was basically an excuse to get away for a few days because I'd been going 18 hours a day. So went down and spent a few days, and I found another picture the other day that I have of when being there at Borden and when we were installing this thing. So that was in '61, and interestingly, the day I was coming home was the day that son Brian was born, March 1961. So that was March '61. So anyway, I stayed in the shop then until February of '62. In December of '61, I was involved with a group, and we organized a New Year's Eve party at the old Brunswick Hotel. And during the evening, I sat to have a drink with the manager of London Life. And during their conversation, he suggested that because he had watched the work I was doing on this party and some other instances through Lions Club and so on before that, so he suggested that maybe I should be looking at being in the life insurance business. So I said, why would I want to do that? Oh, well, he said, it's a good business, you should look at it. And I said, look, it's New Year's Eve, I'm not interested in life insurance or business or anything again for partying. He said, okay, I'll call you tomorrow. So New Year's morning, he's on the phone, he calls me. And I'm still in bed, hungover. And so, of course, there's no sense in trying to talk to him today. Wait until tomorrow. He's been partying all night. Okay. So the next day he called me. And a month later, I had decided to leave CN. After a few interviews with he and George Walker, the regional manager, I decided to leave CN, go into the life insurance business. Anyway, when I handed in my resignation, the superintendent came down to our office and said, man, you got to be crazy. You'll starve to death in the life insurance business. So I said, well, sorry, I've made up my mind. I'm going to go give it a try anyway. In fact, I even asked them if it was possible to get a leave of absence to go try it. And they said, nope, You're burning your bridges. No going back. So I used to say for many years that was some of the best advice I ever had, because every time I got discouraged, I'd say, nope, you're wrong. Again, you're wrong. I'm not going to starve to death. And in fact, 20 years later, I sat across the banquet table from him and asked him if he remembered his advice to me when I left. And he said, no, I have no idea. I said, you told me I'd starve to death, but I just want you to know, I'm doing fine. And his remark at that time was, well, I had an opportunity to go with London Life many years ago, but I was too chicken to try it. Asked for a trip pass, which I thought I was entitled to go to London to New Man School. And the old superintendent in the shop said, no, you're through. When you walk out of here on Friday, you're all through. But on Friday, I got a call from the general superintendent's office, and he wanted to talk to me to find out why I was leaving. So I mentioned this as one of the facts. I said, I've worked here for 15 years. I asked for a pass, and I was turned down. And his reply was, well, maybe we can do something about that. So he called the pass office and said, get Mr. MacFadyen a pass from Moncton to London, Ontario. So when I went to the pass office to pick up the pass, I met a guy I knew who happened to be the secretary to the regional vice president at the time. And he said, Retus, where are you? What are you doing here? And I said, I've just resigned. I'm leaving tomorrow on the train. I'm heading for London, Ontario. I'm going to work for London Life. And he said, well, that's interesting, because I'm leaving on the train tomorrow in the vice president's private car. I'm taking it to Montreal to pick him up. Would you like to join me? So my last trip on CN was in the vice president's private car with our own steward to cook us, and I always remember he cooked us some of the best pork chops I'd ever eaten, and we had the observation deck on the back of the car and our own private bedroom, and that was my last trip on the train. 1962, I started to work for London Life as an agent in Moncton. I spent the first 4 years working in Moncton office as an agent. And I think in 1966 I was appointed as a sales training assistant and offered a chance to move to London to head office for training. However, I decided to forego that, and they allowed me to spend time in London through the fall and winter of 1966 and 67 by spending 2 to 3 weeks in London and then home for a week, so the family didn't have to move. Following that, I was offered a chance to go to Halifax as a staff manager, which I declined, and continued to work as an agent until 1970, when the staff manager in Moncton retired. I was appointed as manager with a staff of 1, and I think a salary or guaranteed income of $400 a month to start to build an agency. So I worked on that starting in 1970 with 1. I hired several agents through the 70s, including son David and Bob Owens, and had a staff of approximately 12 people. By 1981, when the regional manager in Halifax retired, and the Maritime region was split up, and I was given the province of New Brunswick as a regional manager. Who was appointed? David was appointed manager for Moncton. Bob Owens became a manager in St. John. And we continued to build the agency until 1986, when I decided to resign from management and go back to personal production. And at that time, Dave and Bob took over the region. In 1990, January of 1990, I was eligible to take my pension from London Life, but was offered the chance to stay on to service some of my clients. When I came to Moncton, moved into the boarding house, I didn't know anyone. And I remember on Friday nights walking down the main street and standing around wondering if I might possibly see anybody that I knew and not knowing a soul. But one of the first things I did was I started going to Wesley Memorial Church. And I got involved in the young people's group there and met a lot of young people and a lot of people like myself who were from out of town. And so we used to go on Sunday nights. We used to go to some of their homes and have sing songs after church. One on the first people I met, first day on the job, I blistered my fingers trying to put bolt material in or take it out of a furnace, and blistered my fingers. And so the first aid guy bandaged me up, and his name was Don Carson, and he and I became friends. And eventually we got involved in the Reserve Army at that time, and we joined the old field ambulance. So we used to drive ambulances and did some training with militia for a few years. We also got involved with the St. John Ambulance Corps, doing first aid work, and we had a first aid competition team. We used to do competitions and won some competitions for railway cross country. Sundays, summertime and Sundays, they used to run a train, excursion train from Moncton out to Point de Chine. That used to be an outing on Sundays, on the old steam engines and the old cars where there was no air conditioning in them or anything at that time. They'd open the windows and the smoke and cinders from the old steam locomotive would drift in through the cars. But they'd go spend the day out on the beach, gets well sunburned usually. Don't know if we even had any suntan stuff, just a case of get burned and blistered. Yes, you mentioned poker club. We got involved in a little poker club, but guess that came later after we were married. But anyway, I dated a few girls, I guess through young people's. And then 1961, I met Doris. I met her through Don and Vivian Carson on a blind date. And so we didn't have any money or anywhere to go. And so they lived down or had rooms, I guess, down on Bonnecourt Street, close to Maine. So we walked up to Everett and Daisy's on a Sunday evening. That was their first date out. But I guess, well, other than, we'd have chance to go to the movies or go visit somewhere like that. But I think that summer or fall, I had bought an old car. I think it was an old 1937 Plymouth. And it worked great once you got it started, but you had to park it on a hill so you could jump start it most of the time. But I recall one night going with Don and Vivian and Doris and I going to Amherst to they used to have the winter fair in Amherst, so I went down there. And the old car didn't have any heater in it, so you had to have blankets to keep warm that old car. So that fall, right in the fall, I took it back over to the island, stored it in the barn for the winter, because I knew it wasn't going to start when the weather got cold, and no place to park it, I guess, anyway. So in the spring, my cousin Joe called one day and wanted to know if he could buy the car. And I think he gave me something like $300 for it. So by that time we were planning on being married, so I think I had $100 for a ring. And when we ended up being married and leaving on our honeymoon, I think we had $100 to go on the honeymoon for a week to Niagara Falls and back. So when we were married, we got on the train and I had to pass. But anyway, we made it there and back. I got $100. Yeah, friends through the years. Well, Don Carson was about the first friend I made when I came to Moncton. I think, as I mentioned the other night, I blistered my fingers my first day on the job, and Don happened to be a first aider, so he took pity on me and bandaged up my blisters. But we became friends. Then another early friend was Von Downing. I was a blacksmith apprentice, and Von was a boilermaker apprentice, and we had started with CN at about the same time. So as we became friends, we used to go hunting on the weekends, and then we met Mike Harmer, who was another CN employee. And back, I guess, about 1956, 57, after we moved to Riverview, I bought one of our first cars from Mac, which was a 1952 Chev 5-passenger coupe. And that was funny because prior to that we had an old Chev, and it sat in the driveway during the winter. But in the spring, we decided to see if we could get the car started. So Mac came over on Saturday, and we hooked onto the old 47 Chev with his car and towed it down Yale Avenue until it finally fired up on 1 or 2 cylinders and finally got it going. And by the time I got back up to the house with it, there was steam coming up around the windshield, so Mac made the comment that, oh God, he said, this is a new model, it's steam heated. Of course, one of the first friends I met when we moved to Riverview was Mac MacLeod, Mac and Hazel, who became lifelong friends, and they could tell many stories about the trips we made together and the friendship, and their house was always a place where we could stop in any hour of the day and night without invitation, and always be welcome. Unfortunately, Mac passed away back in 1996, so I still miss the old guy until this day. Our first poker club started, I would say, back about the time we were married, 1951-52, and there was people like Ralph Black, Bill Macbeth, and Von Downing, Mac Harmer, and those guys. And at that time we used to play for pennies, and we played for maybe 50-cent poorhouse. So if you lost your 50 cents, you were allowed to stay in the game even though your money was gone, and that was the level of our wealth at that time. Then after moving to the Riverview, we got involved in the poker club, and we had guys like Mac MacLeod, Edgar Mitten, Kenny Mitten, Ali King, Ken Gabby, Albert Johnson, Aubrey Shaw, and Don Dunfield, who was also a long-time friend, who passed away recently at age 91 or 2. 1967 was Expo year, and we rented a cottage from Bill and Barb Reed at Edgewater for a couple of weeks, I guess, while they went to Expo. And that started a long period of summers at Edgewater, because the following year we bought the old cottage at Edgewater. And when we started being out at the shore like that, I met, well, first people like Don Founds, Cecil MacLeod, and got involved in sailing. First on the old Falcon that Cecil had, which was an old wooden sailboat that had a motor in it which didn't usually work, so we spent many late nights getting back if the wind died, and Cecil would never accept a tow, so it was wait till the wind brought us ashore. Then about 1971 or 2, I was invited to sail with Bill and Diane Crandall. I should say we were invited to sail with Bill and Diane Crandall, both Doris and I, on the old Galatea, which was a 37-foot steel-hulled yawl. And we had several good trips with them, including trips to the Bedore Lakes and the Magdalen Islands. And had our final trip with them in August 1976. We had just returned from a trip to the Bedores when they were killed by the explosion of a propane tank which they had in the trunk of their car. And that date fixed in my mind was August 19th, 1976. In the next year after that, we bought the old sailboat Misty Morn from Cumos, and I'm now enjoying my 35th year of sailing that old boat. And I guess touching maybe some of the highlights of that. We spent summers on PEI and in the Bador Lakes. When Doris was living, we used to head out and with her sister Phyllis and husband Fran, and we had many summers where we spent 2 and 3 weeks on the boat sailing to PEI and through the Bador Lakes. In 1981, I was invited to join a crew from Moncton to drive down to Newport, Rhode Island to bring an ocean racing vessel called the Luna Quest up the Atlantic coast around Nova Scotia through the Strait of Canso and back to Shediac. That was about a 5-6 day trip of non-stop sailing offshore in the Atlantic, which was a very memorable experience, and one of at least 7 or 8 that we did over the years through the 1980s. This was first the Luna Quest and the Touch of Time, which were 60-foot sailing boats that we used to bring up around for the summer for Sumner Fraser, who's been a friend for a long time. But that was some of the best sailing we ever had, was sailing, setting up watches, sailing around the clock, running spinnaker. One trip I think we ran the spinnaker for something like 36 hours non-stop, and coming up the Atlantic coast. When Doris and I were first married, we lived in an apartment on Elm Avenue in Moncton. It was a 1-bedroom apartment and not supposed to have any children. However, when David was born in 1954, he was such a cute little guy that the landlord decided that it was okay if we stayed there for a while. So we lived in that apartment until 1954. And then when Doris became pregnant with Gary, we decided that we would have to make a move. So we moved to larger apartment on 161 Cameron Street. And so Gary was born there in June 1955, and I happened to be the one that delivered him as he was born at home. We lived on Cameron Street until March 1956, when we moved to Yale Avenue in Riverview. At that time, we still didn't have a car, so we traveled either with the neighbors or on the bus. And Doris continued to work, so we had several housekeepers through the years. Seemed there was a lot of projects as we moved in because the whole block was new houses. And I think when we moved there was 25 kids on the block and only one of them of school age. That happened to be Jane MacFadyen. The rest were all little guys from around the neighborhood. There was a lot of landscaping to do. a lot of interior work. Don't think there was very much painting done on the rooms inside. So we used to get together with the neighbors, and then we used to say back then it took a quart of paint and a quart of rum to paint a room. But eventually, and it kind of ties into what I said about the old 52 Chev, that when we got that car, then we had transportation. So we lived in that house until, well, Brian was born there when we were living there in 1961, when Brian was born. But the day he was born, I was over in Borden, which I think I touched on earlier, working on and repairing the old Prince Edward Island ferry. In 1962, after I started with London Life, I made a sales call one day at electrical and refrigeration services to talk to them about maybe group insurance or business insurance, and the owner said, I don't need any insurance today, what I need is an electrician. So I said, well, I have a younger brother who's a good electrician, he's over in PEI. He said, bring him over and we'll talk to him. So Brother Everett came over shortly after, and I took him up to electrical and refrigeration, and they hired him, so he came to stay with us at the house until he found a boarding house. Well, he got moved in, and I think 2 years later he was still there until he got married and moved out. So that little house was sort of crowded with Doris and I, 3 boys, a housekeeper, and Brother Everett. So I guess we survived, but everybody had a cot or a bunk or somewhere to sleep on. Back in those days, we used to go either to the, well, I guess both. We went to the Miramichi and usually got up and making hay and up there, and we'd spend a week there, and when we got the hay done there, then we would go over to PEI and find that there was more hay to make over there. So a lot of our vacation time was haymaking. But we used to rent a little cottage in Argyle Shore, and Bill and Ruth used to spend some time there with us. Fawn and Doris Downing spent times with us there. Phil and Fran used to come with their kids. We always laughed about one evening. I think Ellen was a baby when the girls decided that they should put a blanket or towels or something over this window so the sun wouldn't get up and wake the baby. And so I pointed out to them after they got this done that the window that they were covering was on the west side of the house, and there was no way the sun was going to shine in there. We always teased them about that because said, you're not on the New Brunswick side of the Northumberland Strait now, you're on PEI, so the sun gets up in the east. Anyway, 1971, we decided to look for a bigger house. So again, our friends, Bannisters, were being transferred to Montreal, so we made a deal to buy their house on Torwood Court. After Mary and I were married, we decided that we would sell her house on the Coverdale Road, sell the place on Torwood. Her house sold in a matter of weeks. We didn't have any offers on the place in Torwood. So we fixed up an extra bedroom and had her 3 boys plus Brian home for about a year. And then they gradually all moved out. We stayed there in that house until 1990, when we bought the house over at 409 Montgomery. Lived there until about 2003, when we traded houses with Darren and Trish, Mary's son, and moved to 717 Montgomery, where we're living today. In 1972, snowmobiling was a pretty popular sport, and I was been pressured to buy a snowmobile, but I decided that it might be more fun to buy skis and take a couple of ski lessons for the whole family rather than buy a skidoo for everybody to fight over. So we went up to the old King Sports on Mountain Road and bought ski equipment for the whole family. So Brian been very anxious to get out on his skis. Went down to Poley Mountain with friends before we had ours ready to go, and come home the same day with a broken leg. That was his first day on skis. But anyway, we started, and I look back and think of the old wooden skis, leather boots, I think, what do they call them, spring bindings, that were real death traps, but anyway, that's what we started on. But it started something that the whole family became involved in, and I've continued to enjoy. But from that start, I guess our first ski trip was in 1978 when London Life had its sales conference in Banff in December. And so we took our ski gear and were able to get in a few runs of skiing at Lake Louise while we were at the conference. I think it was the next year we went back to Lake Louise, 1979, and skied there with Phyllis and Fran. In 1980, again with Phyllis and Fran, another group, we went to Austria. So we skied in Austria for 3 weeks in 1979. Skied in Lake Louise, 1979. We skied in Austria, 1980, 1981, and 1982. And those were great trips because for anyone to ski in the Alps in Austria with the conditions they have there, it's just something to remember. So then through the years, I've skied in Sugarloaf, Maine. What's the other one? Sunday River. Skied in Vail and Beaver Creek, Colorado. Skied in Sunshine and Lake Louise again. Skied Whistler and Blackcomb. And I think I've had in total 9 trips to Austria for a total of about 25 weeks of skiing in the Alps. Last winter was the first winter I think I missed having skis on, because I chose to go to Florida and stay away from the snow. When Doris died, I found myself alone at home and looking for somebody to talk to who might have similar experiences. I thought of Mary, who's husband had died 3 or 4 years before. I thought, she knows what it's like to be alone, so I called her and asked her if I'd come sit down and chat with her. So that started a romance that continued on, but we laugh now about some of the early things we talked about. And one night we were sitting talking, and I said, Mary, what are you going to do for the rest of your life? And she said, well, I'm looking for 2 millionaires, but one for me and one for my mother. So I said, well, no. Well, I do. And, well, she said, maybe. So shortly after, we went up to Bathurst to visit her mother and meet the rest of her family. And so on that occasion, her mother said, well, Mary, if you don't take him, I will. So that was one of our early things that happened. But so we discussed the pros and cons of marriage and the second family, and her boys were, I guess, 2 of them maybe in university. Darren was in high school, and what do you do how do you get 2 families together, and where do you live, and all this. So anyway, we worked out most of those things. So I said earlier, when we lived in Torwood Court for 7-8 years, I guess. But it's been a very interesting time to have sort of adopted a second family, and a large family, because Mary is the oldest of 11. And we've had a lot of good times together with all of our family, both our brothers, sisters, and our 3 boys. So it's meant we've had 6 boys in a family. Never have been able to get all 6 of them together at one time, but because I live in different areas. But I've enjoyed the life with them. In 1964, after I'd been working with London Life for a couple of years, we had an opportunity to go to Europe on a flight that was organized by the old Board of Trade in Moncton. But I made a New Year's resolution that I was going to earn enough money in sales with London Life to pay for this holiday. But Doris was talking to an old neighbor lady across the street one day, and sort of doubting as to whether we should go, because she said, we don't have furniture, we need a car, we need all kinds of things, and Retus says we should be taking this trip. So old Bertha says, Doris, take your trip. They can always take away your cars or your house or whatever, but they can never take away your memories. So that was a motto that we kind of lived by from then on. And through the years, as we thought about other things to do and other trips to take, like going skiing in Lake Louise, skiing in the Alps in Austria, which Doris and I had, I think, 3 trips over during the early 80s. And later on then, Mary and I skied there 4 or 5 times, I guess. But that was always kind of a point of decision. They can never take away your memories. So it's always left me with great memories about the things that we did. Well, I've seen many people wait and wait till I retire, or wait till this happens, or wait till that happens, and never get there. So the same thing applied, I guess, after Mary and I were married, because in 1987, when I had my first coronary, and recovered from that in 1988, thought, well, we should do some traveling if we're going to see some of this country while I'm still able to drive. So that was when we bought our first motorhome, 23-foot Class C, where we slept up over the cab. But in September of '88, we left here and headed for British Columbia. And at that point, son Dave said, well, Dad, as long as you're going to Vancouver, why don't you go to California? Which we did. And so arrived home 2 months later and said, hey, this is a pretty good way to travel. And so we've continued to travel until now. So 3 motorhomes and many thousands of miles later, we've covered most of North America over the last 25 years or whatever. So that's been a big part of our life. That and skiing in the winter, sailing in the summertime, so it's been a pretty good life. Well, I look back in community activities, and the first thing that comes to mind was back about 1952, but the time we were married, I've been invited to join the Junior Chamber of Commerce. And that was an organization basically of young businessmen. And I think I can still recite the motto of the JCs, we were called, and said, we believe that faith in God gives meaning and purpose to human life, that the brotherhood of men transcends the sovereignty of nations, that economic justice can best be won by free men through free enterprises, that government should be of laws rather than of men, and that service to humanity is the best work of life. And I think there's a lot of things in that I've tended to live by through the years, and I still believe in. Then as we moved to Riverview, and I should say about that, I learned things there, like they offered public speaking courses and how to conduct a business meeting, a lot of things that helped me, and I had a problem with that stuff early on because I was always the guy who didn't have the formal education. Because if you remember, I had grade 9 education, so when you're competing in the business world, that doesn't get you very far. But by taking courses like that, I also took evening courses through the railway and such things as business letter writing, business management, mentioned public speaking, and some of those things that helped me greatly. Then when we moved to Riverview, I don't know which came first. I think maybe the Masonic Lodge was the first thing, because I had joined the Masonic Lodge while we lived on Cameron Street in Moncton, so that would have been 1954, 55. But there was no lodge here in Riverview, so I was one of the organizers of the Masonic Lodge here. And I went through the offices. I was master, I think, in 1963. So, and I received my 50-year membership badge some 4 or 5 years ago. But I've always been closely associated with the lodge. In about 1960, we organized a Lions Club, and I was the first president of the Lions Club, and we celebrated the 60th year last year, and I was invited to be the master of ceremonies for that meeting at the Lions Hall. And that's an organization I've always been proud of because they've always done a lot of work and do still have been a very active club for over 50 years in Riverview. In 1961, I was appointed to a committee of fire wardens to establish a fire department for the then parish of Coverdale. This was before the town of Riverview. And we were responsible for building a fire hall and hiring a fire chief and buying equipment to start the Riverview Fire Department. And we were just 2 weeks ago, we attended a banquet and I was presented with a plaque showing the history of the 50 years of the Riverview Fire Department, which I'm sure if you look at it now, it's got dozens of pieces of equipment and multi-permanent firemen as well as big volunteer staff. So it's been pretty interesting to see that I was a part of that. Another involvement was with the Riverview School Board, and back in the, I guess it started, I think the oldest school in Riverview here, it was built I think somewhere around 1947, but in the early 60s we had our own local Riverview School Board, and I was the last chairman of the Riverview School Board before the amalgamation, which brought Riverview, Moncton, and so on into the present District 2, or whatever it is today. During my time as chairman, we built one section onto the Frank Bowser School. We built an addition onto the West Riverview School, and at that time we worked directly with the architects and the contractors to let the contracts and see the buildings completed. I think 1975 I joined the Moncton Rotary Club, and in 1980-81 I became president of the club and had the opportunity to go to the Rotary's International Convention in Chicago, which Doris and I attended, and there was, I think, somewhere around 7,000 Rotarians from all over the world there, so that was a pretty impressive meeting. Met in the big convention center in downtown Chicago, and so we enjoyed that. I continued to be a member of Rotary until 3 or 4 years ago. I think it was 2006 I received the Paul Harris Fellowship Award, and that is an award in Rotary which is given to anyone who has contributed in excess of $1,000 US to the eradication of tuberculosis throughout the world. Yeah, another organization that I've been involved with for a number of years is the Friends of the Moncton Hospital Foundation. And I joined that, I think, about 1980, and retired as president in 1990 after 10 years on the board, which is the limit we're allowed. And I then served 1 3-year term on the old regional hospital board for Moncton Hospital. One ship sails east and another west, by the self-same winds that blow. Just the set of the sails and not the gales that tells the way we go. Like the winds of the sea are the waves of time, as we journey along through life. Just the set of the soul that determines the goal, and not the calm or the strife. Well, if we're on that subject, another one I like is that the clock of life is wound but once, and no one has the power to tell just when the clock will stop at late or early hour. Now is the only time we have. Love life, toil with a will, for who knows but tomorrow the clock may then be still. Well, I guess, if it's the anything you'd say is that I think we're all basically responsible for our own. It's like quoting set of the sail or those things that, a lot of people like to blame somebody else for their shortcomings or failures, but I think that we're all kind of responsible for our own destiny. I've never aspired to be rich, to have a lot of expensive things. I've always maybe tried to be practical, maybe too much so, but I've always enjoyed trying to share what I have with others, with family, with friends, with anybody who I felt I could help a little bit along the way. I think that I've tried to be supportive of things like the hospital, which I felt helped me to be where I am today. Back in '87, when I was in the hospital for a couple of months, the care I got there and the chance to get out and enjoy another 20 years of life were important. I've always tried to be supportive of not only the local church which I attend, but also the old church at home, where there are a few families left. Will end up someday. And also help Mary in supporting her church. Well, I suppose if I look back and think that the fact that I was able to get away from the old farm and get to Moncton, start with literally nothing. And then back those days, I always remember a lot of the other boys were always going back home for extra money between payday and going back for help, and their parents would be helping them. I never felt I could do that because I knew there wasn't much there, that parents didn't have a lot. The fact that I was able to work through an apprenticeship and then to be appointed as foreman, I guess at the age of 25, when there was a lot of other people competing for that type of promotion. The fact that I enjoyed the years there, and some of the things I was able to do in the shops and do as foreman. And the fact that I was able to leave London life and get into a very high-risk business at that time of selling insurance. Be able to make a success of that, eventually to build an agency literally from nothing. The fact that I was able to influence son Dave to come into a business which he thought wasn't that great at that time, but and to have Bob Owens join us, and the satisfaction of seeing the success that they've both made of their careers, and to be able to and to stay around long after I should have been retired and gone, to see how well things have gone with them, and to continue to be a small part of that organization. I guess to say the toughest part of it all was losing Doris halfway along the way. And that was something that I certainly was not prepared for in any way, and I think back that in all, we were supposed to be estate planners and so on, and that I had all plans made if anything should happen to me, but there was no plan in the works for that she should be gone. It's the fact that I've been able to rebuild a life, have a second life and a second family with Mary has been great satisfaction. To have been able to travel all over North America. We've been in 10 provinces and 44 of the 48 states over the last 20 odd years. And it's also to have survived from heart attack 20-some years ago. And I think often of the guy who was responsible for that, it allowed me to have another 20 odd years of pretty good living. So I guess all I could say to that is life's been pretty good.